Lake Mead is still above the line that once defined its most alarming lows, but the pressure on the reservoir is not easing. It is being squeezed by dry hydrology upstream, by operating rules that are now forcing less water out of Lake Powell, and by a river system that has been running short for years. Federal planners now say Lake Mead is sitting around 1,058.81 feet above sea level, or about 322.8 meters, and the latest weekly update puts its end-of-year projection at 1,056.36 feet, or about 322.1 meters. Under a drier scenario, the same update shows a path to 1,054 feet, or about 321.3 meters by the end of the year. That is not a collapse in a single step. It is a steady slide, and the question is how much lower the system is prepared to let it go before the consequences spread even further. The answer begins upstream. On April 17th, Reclamation said long-term drought, the lowest winter snowpack on record, and record March heat had intensified the basin's stress, leaving the Colorado River system at about 36% of capacity. In the same release, the agency said Lake Powell's minimum probable inflow for water, year 2026, was forecast at just 2.78 million acre-feet, or about 3.5 billion cubic meters, and that without major intervention, Powell could fall below 3,490 feet, or about 1,066 meters, by August. That matters, because Powell and Mead are not separate problems. They are linked by operating rules that move water from one reservoir to the other. When Powell is protected, Mead tends to pay part of the price downstream. That is why the latest federal response focuses on keeping Powell from sinking too far, even if that means less water reaches Mead. Reclamation said it intends to release between 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet from Flaming Gorge Reservoir over the period from April 2026 through April 2027, and to reduce annual releases from Lake Powell to Lake Mead by 1.48 million acre-feet, from 7.48 million to 6.0 million acre-feet through September 2026. The agency said those actions together are expected to lift Powell by about 54 feet, or roughly 16.5 meters, by April 2027. The trade-off is plain in the same announcement. Smaller releases from Powell accelerate the downstream decline of Mead. Reclamation also warned that the reduced releases could cut Hoover Dam's hydropower generating capacity by up to 40% as early as this fall. That is a critical detail because Lake Mead is not only a storage pool for cities and farms, it is also part of the machinery that keeps power flowing through the lower basin. When the lake drops, the water level at Hoover Dam falls with it, and the dam's ability to generate electricity weakens. Reclamation tied the issue directly to the basin's water balance, saying the system needs enough water not just to move downstream, but to keep the infrastructure working the way it was designed to work. Lake Mead's own numbers show how tight the margin has become. The Bureau of Reclamation's weekly hydrologic update for April 19th showed Mead at 1,058.81 feet and 32% full, with a projected end of calendar year elevation of 1,056.36 feet. The same update showed the Colorado River system as a whole at 20,928,000 acre-feet of storage, or 36% of capacity, compared with 23,574,000 acre-feet, or 40%, a year earlier. Powell, meanwhile, was listed at 3,526.08 feet and 24% full, with a projected end-of-year elevation of 3,471.06 feet. That is the upstream setup behind the Mead forecast: low runoff, low storage, and less water moving through the system. The basin's snow and inflow forecasts help explain why the pressure is not going away quickly. In that same weekly update, Powell's water year precipitation to date was listed at 15.43 inches, or 83% of normal, while current snowpack was only 3.08 inches, or 23% of normal. Forecasted water year runoff into Powell had already been revised downward to 3,879,000 acre-feet, or 40% of average, and the April through July runoff forecast fell to 1,400,000 acre-feet, or 22% of average. Those are not the sort of numbers that refill a major reservoir quickly. They are the sort of numbers that keep managers in defensive mode, trying to preserve enough water to avoid worse problems later in the year. This is also why a reservoir that is still more than 1,058 feet high can nevertheless be on a path toward a much lower number. Reclamation's April 2026 Probable Minimum Study Projects, Mead at 1,054.00 feet by December 31, while the probable maximum study puts it at 1,060.04 feet under a wetter scenario. That range may look small in a place where the lake once rose and fell by far more dramatic numbers over decades, but every foot matters when the system is already stressed. 1 foot is enough to change launch conditions, expose more shoreline, complicate hydropower, and tighten the buffer against another dry year. The more unsettling number is the one buried in the longer-term planning files. In a technical appendix to the post-2026 Colorado River Operations Review, Reclamation described an initial condition scenario in which Lake Mead is projected to be at 1,038 feet, or about 315.8 meters, on January 1, 2027. That level would be more than 20 feet below Mead's current April level and below the reservoir's July 2022 record low of 1,040.50 feet, or about 318.1 meters. In other words, the phrase "another 20 feet" is not rhetorical. It matches the scale of decline that one federal planning scenario has already put on paper. The reservoir's historical low matters because it sets the reference point for how serious another drop would be. Reclamation's Lake Mead high and low elevation record shows the lowest elevation in 2022 at 1,040.50 feet. That was the level that exposed previously submerged features and forced a new round of adjustments across the basin. A move to 1,038 feet would not just approach that mark, it would edge beneath it. Even if the decline were gradual instead of abrupt, crossing that line again would have practical consequences for marinas, ramps, shoreline access, and the water intake and power systems that depend on a stable reservoir level. The reason this is happening now is not a single bad season. It is the cumulative effect of years of overuse, warming temperatures, evaporation, and a river compact written for a wetter age. AP reported in August that the Colorado River's cuts for Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico were based on projections for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and that decades of overuse and long-term drought worsened by climate change mean there is more demand than the river can reliably supply. Reclamation's own basin overview says the Colorado River is a critical resource for 7 basin states, 30 Native American tribes, 2 Mexican states, and tens of millions of people who rely on it for municipal needs, agriculture, hydropower, recreation, and wildlife habitat. That is the scale of the system behind every forecasted foot of decline. The drought cuts are already embedded in the operating picture. Reclamation's August 2025 24-month study projected Lake Mead to remain in a shortage condition for calendar years 2025 and 2026, with projected elevations between 1,075 and 1,050 feet. That study also said the water year 2026 release from Powell was projected at 7.48 million acre-feet, though actual operations could be lower depending on hydrology and the record of decision requirements. By April 2026, the agency had gone further, saying it intends to lower the annual release from Powell to 6.0 million acre-feet through September, which is exactly the kind of adjustment that lowers Mead downstream. The forecast changed because the hydrology did. That shift matters because Mead is not being drained by local use alone. It is being shaped by what reaches it from upstream. Reclamation's April weekly update estimated only 83,000 acre-feet of Lake Mead inflow in the 24-month study projection for April, while the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center's forecast was 71,000 acre-feet, or 90% of average for that specific intervening flow estimate. Those are relatively small inflows compared with the scale of the reservoir, which is why even modest changes in Powell releases can move Mead noticeably over time. The lake is operating inside a narrow band where upstream flow, evaporation, and contractual deliveries all matter at once. The operating rules themselves are now part of the story. Reclamation noted in April that the current agreements governing Lake Powell and Lake Mead run through the end of the year, and that the basin states have not yet reached consensus on a post-2026 framework. The agency's Colorado River page says the post-2026 process is underway, while the draft environmental impact statement released in January describes a broad range of alternatives without naming a preferred option. That means the basin is being run under a set of rules that are temporary, while the next rulebook is still being negotiated. In a system this dry, uncertainty is not a side issue. It is part of the operating pressure. For Mead, that uncertainty is especially sharp because the reservoir has already spent years below the elevation that once triggered shortage fears. The August 2025 study made that point directly, saying Mead was projected to be below 1,075 feet and above 1,050 feet at the start of 2026, with shortage conditions in place. The current April 2026 update shows the lake still inside that lower band, not recovering enough to move the basin into a more comfortable operating zone. That is why projections of another 20-foot drop are not treated as alarmism by water managers. They are treated as a plausible outcome if inflows stay weak and release reductions continue. There is also a simpler way to read the numbers. The system is trying to protect both reservoirs at once, and that is getting harder. The April reclamation release said Powell's release reductions may keep the lake from slipping below 3,490 feet, which is the minimum power pool level at Glen Canyon Dam. But by withholding water there, the system necessarily sends less to Mead. Reclamation explicitly acknowledged that the downstream decline of Mead will accelerate. That is the trade being made: preserve one reservoir's ability to function and accept more strain in the other. It is a balancing act, but it is a balancing act under severe drought, not a balanced river. That trade also carries a public cost. AP noted that Lake Powell releases and reduced downstream flows have ripple effects across power customers, and Reclamation said reduced water at Hoover Dam could reduce power generation by as much as 40%. The same official release said recreation could also be affected at Lake Mead National Recreation Area, as lower levels reduce boating access. This is where the reservoir's decline stops being an abstraction. It touches electricity, park access, water deliveries, and the daily logistics of a basin built around a river that is now running leaner than the old operating rules assumed. The long view is even more important than the monthly update. Reclamation says the Colorado River system began the current year with just about 36% of capacity, and the basin has already faced mandatory cutbacks every year since 2022. AP reported that Arizona will again take an 18% cut, Nevada 7%, and Mexico 5% under the latest federal forecast, while California avoids cuts because of senior water rights. That allocation structure does not fix the shortage, it only distributes the pain. The result is that even with conservation already in place, the system can still be pushed toward lower reservoir levels if hydrology stays poor. That is why another 20-foot loss at Lake Mead is such a serious number. It would not just be a lower water line on a chart. It would bring the reservoir closer to, and potentially below, its recent record low, while putting more strain on Hoover Dam's generation, recreation access, and the lower basin's already limited buffer. The official forecasts now show a reservoir that is still functioning, still holding substantial water, but still moving in the wrong direction. The next months will be shaped by snowmelt, inflow, and the final decisions made under a set of river rules that are about to expire. The projected range that places Lake Mead near 1,056 feet, or about 322 meters, by the end of the current year feeds directly into the opening conditions of the next cycle. That carryover is critical. A reservoir that begins a new year already near 1,054 feet, or roughly 321 meters, is not starting from a neutral position. It is entering the next runoff season with reduced storage, diminished flexibility, and a narrower margin to absorb further losses. That is where the scenario placing the reservoir near 1,038 feet, or about 315.8 meters, at the start of 2027 becomes a continuation rather than an outlier. The difference between those elevations is not a sudden drop but a sustained imbalance between incoming and outgoing water. When inflow remains below average and upstream releases are deliberately reduced, The arithmetic is straightforward. The reservoir loses more than it gains, and the decline extends across months rather than appearing as a single event. The influence of upstream operations remains central to this pattern. The earlier adjustment that lowers releases from Lake Powell to about 6.0 million acre-feet, or roughly 7.4 billion cubic meters, reshapes the volume of water entering Lake Mead over time. Even without additional reductions, maintaining that lower transfer rate through successive months compounds the effect. Each week of reduced inflow subtracts from the reservoir's ability to stabilize, especially when local inflows are modest and evaporation continues to draw water away from the surface. Seasonal timing further complicates the picture. Snowpack accumulation during winter sets the stage for spring runoff, but the benefits of that snowpack are delayed. If accumulation is weak, as reflected in earlier measurements showing snowpack far below average, the shortfall is not immediately visible in reservoir levels. It emerges gradually as the expected surge of meltwater fails to arrive in sufficient volume. By the time that absence is fully reflected in inflow data, operational decisions have already been made based on conservative forecasts, reinforcing the downward trend. Temperature plays a parallel role that does not depend on river flow. Warmer conditions increase evaporation rates across the reservoir's surface. Even as the lake shrinks in area, the combination of high temperatures and low humidity can sustain significant evaporative losses. Over the course of a season, those losses represent a measurable volume that would otherwise contribute to stabilizing the reservoir. In years marked by persistent heat, evaporation becomes a steady drain that operates alongside reduced inflow, not in place of it. Demand within the basin continues to exert its own pressure. Water deliveries downstream are governed by long-standing agreements that remain in effect even under shortage conditions. While reductions have been implemented, they do not eliminate the requirement to move water through the system. This creates a baseline outflow that persists regardless of hydrologic variability. In practical terms, Lake Mead cannot simply retain water to halt its decline. It must continue meeting delivery obligations, and those obligations maintain a consistent draw on storage. The interaction between these factors becomes more pronounced as elevations fall. At higher levels, a favorable runoff season can produce noticeable gains in elevation. At lower levels, the same volume of water yields a smaller vertical increase due to the reservoir's geometry. This means recovery becomes progressively more difficult as the lake declines. A year of average inflow may stabilize the reservoir temporarily, but it is less likely to produce a significant rise without consecutive years of above-average conditions. Operational uncertainty also enters the equation as the current management framework approaches its endpoint. With new guidelines still under development, near-term decisions are shaped by interim measures rather than a finalized long-term plan. This environment encourages cautious operation, where preserving system stability takes precedence over aggressive recovery attempts. Reduced releases, conservative forecasts, and incremental adjustments define this approach, and each of those elements tends to limit the volume of water reaching Lake Mead. Infrastructure considerations begin to align more closely with these hydrologic trends as levels decline. Hydropower generation at Hoover Dam depends on sufficient water elevation to maintain pressure through the turbines. As the reservoir drops, that pressure decreases, affecting output. The earlier indication that generating capacity could be reduced significantly reflects this direct relationship between elevation and energy production. The effect is gradual, tied to each incremental foot of decline, rather than a single threshold. Access and shoreline conditions evolve in parallel. Lower elevations extend the distance between fixed infrastructure and the waterline, requiring ongoing adjustments to maintain usability. Boat ramps, marina locations, and navigation routes adapt as the reservoir recedes, and these changes accumulate over time. While they do not alter the hydrologic balance, they reflect the practical consequences of sustained decline across the system. Taken together, these elements reinforce the same underlying direction established earlier. Reduced inflow, constrained upstream releases, ongoing demand, and environmental losses combine to sustain pressure on Lake Mead. The projected drop of another 20 feet fits within this framework as a plausible extension of current conditions rather than a separate development. As the system moves forward, Each of these factors continues to operate simultaneously, shaping the reservoir's level through incremental changes that build over successive seasons.